This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hey, thank you so much for joining us on The World Today on CGTN. I'm Li Qiuyuan coming to you live in Beijing. Our top story this hour, Chinese President Xi Jinping is now in Moscow for a state visit to Russia. A welcoming ceremony has been held in the Kremlin. And President Xi Jinping and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, have now begun their talks with delegation members. The talks will be followed by a meeting in an extended format and a document signing ceremony. Chinese President Xi Jinping has met with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Moscow earlier Monday, and Zhang Dan has more details.
During their meeting at the Kremlin, Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin had an in-depth and candid exchange on bilateral relations and issues of mutual interest. The two presidents held close exchanges over the past decade. They said both countries are committed to realizing national development and rejuvenation, support world multipolarity, and work for greater democracy in international relations. President Xi spoke highly of China-Russia relations, saying the two nations are each other's biggest neighbor and comprehensive strategic partner of coordination. Xi told Putin that China is firm in strengthening strategic coordination with Russia. The Chinese president also said the two countries should further deepen practical cooperation in various fields, as well as strengthen coordination and collaboration on multilateral platforms. President Putin extended a warm welcome to Xi. The Russian president acknowledged the fruitful results of bilateral relations in recent years and voiced to continue to deepen practical cooperation. The two leaders also exchanged views on the Ukraine conflict. Xi Jinping reiterated China's position, promising more constructive efforts in promoting a political settlement through dialogue and negotiation. The Chinese president also rejected the Cold War mentality and unilateral sanctions. Putin said that Russia appreciates China for consistently upholding an impartial, objective, and balanced position and standing for fairness and justice on major international issues. Putin said Russia has carefully studied China's position paper and is open to talks for peace. He said Russia welcomes China to play a constructive role in this regard. Also during Xi's visit, the two presidents are expected to draw up a new blueprint for a bilateral comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination. Zhang Dan, CGTN.
And earlier on Tuesday, Chinese President Xi Jinping met with Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin. She said both sides should promote quality and quantity in economic cooperation, promote trade and investment liberalization, and maintain the security and stability of supply chains. President Xi also said the two countries should leverage the driving effect of major connectivity projects, jointly safeguard energy security, expand bilateral economic and trade exchanges, strengthen research and innovation cooperation, and promote sustainable development. The Prime Minister of Russia said Russia is willing to strengthen cooperation with China in fields such as trade, energy, aviation, space exploration, cross-border logistics, and science and technology innovation. Well, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Wang Wenbin has reiterated China's position on the Ukraine issue, slamming U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's accusation on China providing, quote, diplomatic cover to Moscow. Wang said the U.S. was, quote, in no position to fight to point fingers at China. Take a listen.
China is neither the creator nor a party to the Ukraine crisis, nor has it provided weapons to any party to the conflict. The United States is in no position to point fingers at China, let alone shift blame to China. The United States claims to prevent war, but there are only a handful of conflicts and wars that break out in Europe and even the world, which has nothing to do with the United States.
And earlier, my colleague Kate Quay spoke with the chairman of the Russian-Asian Union of Industrialists and Entrepreneurs. He talked about the current and future developments of economic and trade relations between China and Russia.
Mr. Mankiewicz, thank you so much for your time. From business community's perspective, what are you expecting out of this time's state leaders' visit to Russia?
Конечно же, большие ожидания. Мы очень верим.
We hold great expectations for the upcoming meeting between the leaders of both parties. We believe it will bring about more positive developments, especially in the cooperation between Russia and China. Strategic decisions will be made to facilitate collaboration between our companies, which will help us better avoid sanctions from the West and ensure that Chinese companies are not affected by such measures. Overall, we are confident that this leadership summit will significantly promote cooperation among our companies.
How important is China market to you, and how do you position China market when you do your business?
Ну, во-первых, я считаю, что
I believe that the Chinese market is the #1 market for Russian companies. The vast Chinese market presents a great prospect for Russia. For a long time, China has been Russia's largest trading partner, with bilateral trade reaching almost $197 billion last year, close to the $200 billion target. According to our projections, this year, bilateral trade between China and Russia is expected to exceed $250 to $260 billion.
The French government has survived 2 votes of no confidence in parliament as anger grows over its controversial pension reform. The government wants to raise the retirement age from 62 to 64, but there's massive public and union opposition to its plans, which it forced through parliament last week. Ross Cullum has more in Paris.
They marked the latest act in France's political drama as 2 opposition votes of no confidence fell short of bringing down the government. The Prime Minister narrowly escaping what would have been a first defeat of this kind since 1962. Elizabeth Bourne defended her pension reform in Parliament, but opposition lawmakers saying that her government is already dead. It forced through the pensions reform legislation last week by using a controversial but constitutional tool to bypass Parliament, but that sparked days of unrest, riots, fires and hundreds of arrests. The narrow margin of victory for the government does not restore political stability, and they still face huge opposition to the pensions reform. There's going to be another day of social action on Thursday with a general strike planned and protests up and down the country, with hundreds of thousands of people expected to attend. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
Supporters of South Africa's opposition party have taken to the streets across the country to protest against continued power cuts and poor government service delivery. The ruling African National Congress said it was fully committed to doing what the people of South Africa expect, demand, and deserve. But the protests were extremist and regressive. Julie Shire reports.
South Africa's capital, Pretoria, came to a standstill as the economic freedom fighters led a nationwide shutdown. On the eve of Human Rights Day, the opposition party is demanding an end to load shedding and for Cyril Ramaphosa's resignation as president.
We are tired of corruption. We are tired of what they are doing. We are tired of Ramaphosa. In fact, we are saying Ramaphosa must go. Ramaphosa must go, and he must go now.
As Forum for Service Delivery, the services within our country is very bad. We don't have a roads, the security, in terms of the crime is very high.
Sporadic incidents of violence broke out and dozens of arrests were made overnight, but protests mostly remained peaceful amid a strong show of police and army presence. The EFF has vowed to continue to fight if President Ramaphosa defies the call to end his term.
We'll continue to intensify our protests. We'll continue to hold him accountable in Parliament and use legislative means and the courts as well. It's going to be continued rolling protests.
Similar protests erupted in Nigeria, Tunisia, Senegal and Kenya over high levels of corruption, unemployment, poverty and growing inequality.
I think this is a dangerous formula in the long run, which states and governments are able to at best contain, but they are not going to resolve them with the current courses of action unless you have a broad-based, sustainable development approach that actively tries to be much more inclusive.
We think that this is a reflection of a new wave of politics which are being ushered into the continent, where we're going to get rid of the liberation movements as custodians of our future.
There's a growing discontent not just in South Africa but in other nations too. African people want jobs and better lives for themselves and for generations to come. Julie Shara, CGTN, South Africa.
The death toll from Saturday's earthquake in Ecuador has risen to 15, with hundreds more injured. The Ecuador's president has declared a state of emergency as officials work to respond to the disaster and assess damage. The province of El Oro took the hardest hit. Our Nicholas Suarez has more from its capital, Machala.
2 days after the 6.5 magnitude earthquake struck the southern coast of Ecuador, life seems to go on in some parts of Machala, the most impacted city. But for other families who lost their homes and the relatives who lost their loved ones, there has been no rest since the catastrophe.
This is very anguishing. In my 55 years, I have never lived through something like this. We had minor movements, but never an earthquake like this.
The earthquake's epicenter was in Balao, a small town located about 60 kilometers from Machala. Behind me, you can see Machala's Boardwalk and Maritime Museum, constructed over 100 years ago. Both collapsed after Saturday's earthquake. The majority of all the deaths reported took place here in El Oro province. Dozens of homes were destroyed here too. Local authorities say immediate action was taken to assist the community and that more help is on the way.
Immediately, we sent our workforce to rescue victims. Then we brought in machinery for removing the rubble, and then we made an evaluation for giving humanitarian assistance. We have asked to do a full evaluation of the buildings because many of them are not safe anymore.
The earthquake struck at 12 minutes past noon on Saturday, taking citizens by surprise. The poorest neighborhoods were the most damaged due to improvised constructions not up to earthquake standards. Many of these structures simply collapsed into the estuary.
Families have a lot of fears and needs, especially the ones living at the shore of the estuary. This event affected very poor people that have nowhere to go. The worst part is that the authorities have showed up, but with no help.
While the government has pledged aid for all the victims, some of those here in the most affected neighborhoods say it's not coming fast enough and that as of now, they have no place to go, nowhere to live. Ecuador is located in the so-called Ring of Fire, an area in the Pacific Ocean prone to earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and tsunamis. This was the strongest quake to hit Ecuador since 2016, when a 7.8 magnitude quake killed nearly 700 people. President Guillermo Lasso has declared a nationwide state of emergency and promised to give disaster relief grants for affected families, who are still in fear of aftershocks. Nicolás Suárez, CGTN, Machala, Ecuador.
Turkey is one of the world's most seismically active countries, and nearly 50,000 people were killed in last month's earthquakes in the southeastern province of Kahramanmaraş, and over 200,000 buildings were destroyed there. Now anxiety is skyrocketing in the country's most populous city, Istanbul, where a major earthquake has long been expected. Mihal Vardovic reports.
The big one is known in Turkey as the Istanbul earthquake, yet to happen. For years, seismologists have been warning that the city is due for a major earthquake before 2030, as it lies on the North Anatolian fault line. The two massive earthquakes that shook 11 provinces in southeastern Turkey on February 6, killing nearly 50,000 people, has become a wake-up call for millions in Istanbul. According to the Istanbul municipality, if this city is hit by an earthquake with a magnitude of 7.5 or higher, as predicted, at least 200,000 buildings would be destroyed. Local officials say that would likely mean at least tens of thousands of people will be killed and millions will be left homeless. Overwhelmed by reports of an expected doomsday, locals in Istanbul are frantically trying to get their building inspected. The Istanbul municipality has received over 100,000 new applications for safety checks they've been conducting across the city.
First, a scrapping process is performed on the column. Then we measure the concrete's strength by cracking it slightly. And later, we determine the thickness of the reinforcement and whether it has been subjected to corrosion. These data are entered into a special program along with the ground values. And the building's safety ratio is determined in 5 separate groups from A to E.
Gülbahar is one of the millions living in Istanbul experiencing anxiety.
We have applied for our building to be inspected, but it will take time. I'm very worried because this compound was built before the construction laws became stricter in 1999. My building also has 2 illegally built extra floors, so that concerns me.
Buildings deemed risky during inspections are marked for demolition. The municipality provides 4,500 lira, nearly $240 for temporary accommodation for people whose buildings are set to be demolished. But rent has soared in the city.
I'm having trouble sleeping. All we hear and talk about is what will happen when the earthquake happens. If my building is found to be risky, I don't know how I will afford to find a new, safe apartment. It's concerning.
As Istanbul prepares for the possibility of a devastating earthquake, residents like Gulbahar are left with uncertainty and anxiety about their safety and future. Michal Bardavid, CGTN, Istanbul.
A United Nations climate official has called for greater political will for more action in tackling climate change. Executive Secretary at the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, Simon Stell, said there was still time to act after the publication of a report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The report says the world is likely to pass a dangerous temperature threshold within the next 10 years, pushing the planet past the point of catastrophic warming. Emissions must be halved by the mid-2030s if the world is to have a chance of limiting the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And beyond that point, scientists say the impacts of catastrophic weather will become significantly harder for humanity to handle.
Facing the unknown is always difficult.
All right, we want to take you live to Moscow now. You're now watching a live picture coming from Moscow. Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting with Russian leaders at the Kremlin during his state visit to Moscow. This is the live picture from Moscow. During talks, the president said the two countries should deepen practical cooperation in various fields. And this is the second day of this meeting. Take a listen.
We have continued to broaden our cooperation, and we would like to further deepen a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination for a new era. And we will also lay out our bilateral plans until 2030. These two documents will include the various areas of our cooperation and also will be the guidance for our future cooperation. Our two countries have a lot of commonality in terms of the national governance and development. We also made a plan to further boost the ministerial cooperation. Although COVID-19 imposed some obstacles to our cooperation, but we still see a record high in terms of bilateral trade in year 2022. And this year, our bilateral trade is expected to surpass $200 billion. Actually, this we have mentioned for many times, and we also laid a solid target before, and we for sure, and this year will surpass that number, at the 200 billion threshold. And we also would like to seize more opportunities to unleash the potentials for bilateral cooperation, and will with the help of the Belt and Road Initiative. We also laid out the 80 projects for bilateral cooperation with great significance, totaling more than $165 billion. And we are also a key supplier of the natural gas, coal, the LNG, and also will have a cooperation in developing the nuclear energy. And we have seen an increase in the demand of energy and also the further cooperation area. And we also have other bilateral projects.
You're now watching the live picture of the meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Vladimir Putin. This is the second day of the meeting between the two presidents. They have an in-depth and candid exchange on China-Russian relations, an issue of mutual interest. And remember, China and Russia trade exceeded $190 billion last year, and that's up by 116% from 10 years ago when President Xi first took office. And China has been Russia's largest trading partner for 13 years running. A steady increase has been seen in two-way connectivity and investment as well. We want to put things into perspective. Let me now bring in my guests here in the studio. Mr. Cui Hongjian, Director of Department for European Studies at Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and Professor Liu Baocheng, Dean of Center for International Businesses Ethics at the University of International Business and Economics. Great to have you both with us. This is such a high-stake meeting, one that is closely watched by the world. And you just heard President Putin given a speech there saying they expect to unleash their trade relations in the coming years, even wider cooperation. What do you think?
I think it's a historical and also critical juncture at the moment because the world is watching over what is going on with the Ukraine conflict over there and how that's going to impact not only the current supply of key materials from energy to food, but also how that's going to impact the world pattern, whether we are going for more of the multipolar type of the world landscape, or are we still have to live with the hegemon that is they're dominated by the West. And right now, I think China is really there to, number one, is to take a responsible approach as a big nation and also as a big neighbor and also as a big partner of Russia. So China is there to propose the peace settlement positions. And we always believe, actually from our past experience and also from both a joyful and painful experience between China and Russia, and we conclude that only the peace and development will be the solution for providing the happiness of the people. It's not really the ambition of any type of particular leader that are there to prevail over the benefit of the people on the ground. And so therefore, economic cooperation is the key. And right now we have so much more to share. Yes, we are close to the hallmark of $200 billion trade, and by next year, actually, it's going to exceed the commitments that leaders have set forth. And right now, in addition to energy, which is really the conventional commodity, but e-commerce and technology cooperation, aerospace, civil aviation, and also exploration of the Arctic path for peaceful use. And then people-to-people exchange, and I think more realistically, it is really the collaboration for agricultural development, because China does really have the technology, have the right type of seed banks, have the right type of labor, where the Far East is really a fertile land that is not really highly populated. So therefore, there's large room to collaborate. But however, given all the ceremonies, given all the grand declarations, government have their own limited role. So they are there to point directions, they are there to pave the road. But it is, in the end, the business community who will be there to sit in the driver's seat. And their expectation will have to be met by the more of a stable, transparent rule of law on the ground. Instead of only the leader's commitment.
And as we speak, that meeting is still ongoing. We're expecting President Xi to speak in a few moments. But we're also expecting a joint signing ceremony. That's according to Kremlin at the end of the day. What would you be watching out for, Professor Cui?
Yes, just like Mr. Liu mentioned, this is very important, especially for both countries in a very, very also critical time. But of course, this time I think the bilateral relations, firstly, it's a very, very, top priority for both sides. No matter what happens, in the regions and in the world, I think that once both two countries to strengthen the cooperation and also to keep the stability and also healthy development for these bilateral relations, it itself give a big contribution to the stability for the world. But of course, this time I think we can have this opportunity to watch some more concrete, cooperation go ahead. For example, this time both two sides will try to sign a new statement and to promote these bilateral relations in a new background. On the other hand, of course, how could both two countries to conclude the development in the past years and how to promote some new areas for some, just like President Putin mentioned, unleash some potential for trade, for energy, for any kind of cooperation. So this time, not only a significant, political meaning for both the countries, for regions, and for the world. And I think that also some very, very practical, products for this cooperation.
As you said, the two presidents have said that they plan to draw up a new blueprint for China-Russia comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination in the years to come. What could that blueprint look like? Which direction would it go?
I think firstly, the blueprint, which means that not only we need to...
It looks like I'm sorry to interrupt there. I think President Xi is about to speak at that meeting. Let's go live there.
Your Excellency, President Vladimir Putin, I would like to again thank you for inviting me to visit Russia. With the concerted efforts of both sides, China and Russia's relations has maintained a sound and steady growth. We build up our mutual trust and also have seen a more convergence of interests, and we also have seen increase of people-to-people exchange. The economy, investment, energy, people-to-people exchange, cultural exchange, and also the sub-national cooperation all have made new progress. Yesterday evening and early today, and also just now, we had several rounds of in-depth exchange of views. Our cooperative areas have been further expanded, and we have also built up our consensus. And we also have seen the benefit delivered from our early cooperation, and also we have redoubled efforts to further boosting our following cooperation. Just now, President Putin mentioned that this year is the first year to fully implement the guiding principles of the 20th National Congress, and we will also to foster a new development paradigm and also to boost high-quality development and further advance the Chinese modernization.
All right, that was President Xi speaking at the meeting, talking about, the bilateral cooperation between the two sides have expanded over the years, from trade to people-to-people exchanges and even cultural exchanges. How are you looking at those remarks made by the president? What can we look forward to in terms of the ties between the two countries in the coming years? They are there to chart a new chapter, isn't it?
Well, neighbors cannot really be reallocated, so therefore we have to live with it, and why don't really forge a more friendly tie with each other? So despite of the differences and despite of the different expectations of the global community, the first consideration is how that is going to best serve its own national interest. At the moment, China is heavily reliant on the supply of raw materials from energy to fertilizer and to the grain, etc. So Russia is really a ready supplier. And it seems that Russia has made a number of efforts to be Europeanized, but it was being rejected for one reason or the other. And now they shifted strategy to look to the east. And then China is both the destination and also the hub towards a further east. So therefore, they do